Who the heck are you?
I'm a history teacher from the future, and I'm here to tell you that America is going to need you for World War III.
Not this again. So I'm guessing this happened sometime in the 90s.
Well, actually more like 2032.
How far out? And let me guess. We finally fight against the Soviets.
Oh no, they crumbled to pieces in 1991.
Seriously? It must be Japan then. I knew we couldn't trust them after last time.
Actually, no. They end up being one of your closest allies. It's a superpower battle between you and China.
You must be on death sticks or something. That's not possible. They're as poor as Lesotho.
Actually, technically even poorer. Let me explain how the most powerful kingdom of all time woke up from their slumber. So, because when we think of China, we think of this, it's very easy to have short memories and to forget just how poor they actually were a couple of decades ago. But I tell you who doesn't have short memories, the Chinese. You see, not only were 250 million people living in absolute poverty by 1978, but the nation was still licking its wounds after going through the century of humiliation in the 1800s, where their power in Asia completely waned to the Europeans. Just think about how incredible it is to have a whole century devoted to humiliation. The closest thing that we had to that was when Thorpe fell in the pool. And not only that, but the 1800s showed that being a powerful nation was impossible without having first industrialized. And well, China was so far from industrialized that Mao himself rewrote the rules of communism so that the revolution began with rural peasants rather than urban workers, because quite simply, there weren't many. Add to this the absolute failure of Mao's Great Leap Forward in the early 1960s, resulting in 30 million deaths from starvation, and the Cultural Revolution, which turned the nation against each other less than a decade later, and what was once the most powerful kingdom in the world had a lower gross national income per capita than both Lesotho and Burkina Faso. So after Mao died in 1976, Deng Xiaoping became victorious in a power struggle between him and another guy, Hua Guofeng. For Deng, it was clear. If China wanted to return to anywhere near their former glories, it needed wealth. And to get wealth meant abandoning the revolution and enacting urgent reform. Now, let's be clear, in the late 70s, Deng was one of the last remaining OG revolutionaries. He was there all the way back in the Chinese Civil War. But for Deng, Mao had served his purpose. Like the original Emperor Qin, he'd unified a nation once divided by warlords, and unlike the West, Mao had unified China into a system where the party rather than business controlled the economy. This put Deng in a unique position where change could not only happen, but could happen at lightning pace. So, breaking communist orthodoxy, Deng Xiaoping announced that changes were coming, and that in order to get wealthy, some would get rich first. Obviously, this raised the question by many that this isn't really communism at all. Deng replied that this absolutely was socialism, but with Chinese characteristics. Wealth wasn't the enemy. A ruling class that oppressed the underclass was. For Deng, wealth and collective power were part of the Chinese DNA.
For over 1,000 generations, the Chinese were the guardians of power and prosperity across the Middle World. Before the Dark Times, before the European empires.
I know, mate, I basically just said that.
Just making sure we're all on the same page.
So Deng's first key economic reform was something called special economic zones. Essentially, these were areas that didn't really have to follow the same economic rules as the rest of the country. You could say that there were small capitalist districts within the country, and the number of these gradually increased throughout the 1980s. The fact that this was a gradual increase was crucial. Russia showed us in the 1990s that going to capitalism overnight can create an oligarchy, as a very small set of hands buy up all the ownership in the former state-owned businesses, and no one gets lifted out of poverty.
Stop using words like oligarchy and capitalism. I'm too stupid, Mr. Mitchell. Make it simpler.
Okay, I'll put it this way. So under Mao, the government pretty much owned all business, but in these special economic zones, businesses were allowed to freely operate, and the government had low tax rates. What this meant was that businesses were incentivized to come set up here to take advantage of cheap labor and low taxes. The first of these zones was in Shenzhen, and then it spread across the east coast to those rich cities you might know, like Shanghai and Guangzhou. Go figure why they're rich. So the effects of this policy were twofold. Firstly, this brought much needed capital into China, as foreign businesses like General Motors were setting up operations in the Middle Kingdom. But secondly, it allowed China to at last properly industrialize. Mao had tried this with his Great Leap Forward, which ended in disaster, but now with foreign businesses training Chinese employees with leading-edge technology, China was ready for its real Great Leap Forward. And at this point in history, America was happy with this. China was far from a powerhouse, yet provided their companies with a workforce that was cheap, abundant, and extremely hard-working, not to mention the enticing tax breaks that Deng Xiaoping was offering. And so it was for this reason that America was so eager to see the Chinese economy kickstarted. So this guy right here was a guy called Zhao Ziyang. Forgive me, but I'm going to be really technical right now. In terms of the Politburo's pecking order, Deng Xiaoping was technically third behind Hu Yaobang and then our mate Zhao Ziyang. Hu was in charge of political reform while Zhao was in charge of economic reform, and Deng was something of their overlord. So with America keen to see the Chinese economy kick-started, Zhao Ziyang went knocking for loans and secured loans from the IMF and the World Bank, including a $200 million loan for microcomputers. With the allure of coastal riches, tens of millions of Chinese went to work in the dozens of SEZs that were there by the end of the 1980s. Now, remember that line that Deng said before, some would get rich first. Well, while the urban East was beginning to flourish, the agricultural West was stuck in poverty. And as far as Deng was concerned, with the East now rising and the government treasury growing, the Communist Party was in a position to incentivize greater grain production and raise more people out of poverty. And so Deng introduced a sweeping set of agricultural reforms.
No, just no way, man.
Okay.
You're taking permits World War III, not farming.
No, but the farming reforms were crucial because it showed the way the Chinese economy would end up going with heavy private incentives, but far from an unregulated market. You see, Deng reduced farming taxes so that the money could be spent on equipment, gave farmers greater say as to what crops were grown, and introduced reverse economies of scale. i.e., if a farmer produced more, they would be paid more per bushel. The effects of this were felt immediately, with grain output reaching record levels in 1979, but the West was still far from out of poverty, and so Deng and Zhao turned to a new policy, the Hukou system. Essentially, this system involved Western workers gaining temporary migrant status in the east of China, with the goal of them taking that newfound wealth back to the West. Finally, America did a solid favour to China with the introduction of the Plaza Accord in 1985. From 1980 to 1985, the value of the American dollar appreciated by 50% in contrast to the Japanese yen. This basically meant that Japanese imports were much cheaper than the more expensive American dollar. The Plaza Accord was basically an agreement to increase the value of the yen, and while this did reduce Japan's exporting power, it simply left a vacuum for another awakening Asian nation, China. So by the end of the 1980s, China's GDP per capita was double what it was back in 1978. Just for scale, Lesotho, who we mentioned before, increased by 65% in the same time. The astonishing difference is that Lesotho was managing an economy of 1.8 million, whereas China was managing an economy of 1.1 billion. Now, of course, there were plenty of issues with this burgeoning economic growth. Inflation grew to be quite high, corruption was rampant, and the Hukou system led to a huge underclass of legal immigrants who refused to return home after tasting Eastern riches. More on what this would lead to at the end though. So, don't get me wrong, China was still incredibly poor. By 1990, their GDP per capita was $317 compared to South Korea's $6,000 and Japan's $25,000. But the trajectory was clearly set, and Deng Xiaoping was eager to use this growth to modernize the military. We even found these old voicemails on his phone.
Hey Deng, seems like we're playing phone tag right now. Just calling back about battle tips. Of course a double lightsaber is essential, but seriously, stop using them on civilians and actually get them to fight outside us. Oh, also I've got Ventress here on speaker.
Yeah, clear out the military. It's too bloated.
Are you a good one? The two. Flick me an email if that's not clear.
So the military needed serious cleaning out. Essentially, Mao had used the military as a political tool to suppress dissent, and because he was so focused on quashing rebels in Tibet and Xinjiang, hadn't given any focus to the navy. So Deng was clear. The army weren't to be the foot soldiers of any personal crusade from a particular leader, but they were also to answer to the government and not dictate terms like the Japanese military did during World War II. The way that Deng did this was by appointing his supporters into key military positions. Deng also went on a technological drive, forcing closer cooperation between military and civilian science units. China also played a much more active role in the international arms market and upgraded their weapons, and then lastly, when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, China could change the function of its small navy. Previously, the navy had mainly patrolled the rivers for border patrol, but after the Soviet Union fell, Deng could afford to restation more ships in the sea, and Deng Xiaoping made them no longer subordinate to the army, as Mao had done earlier. So the sleeping giant had clearly awoken, and now with the Soviet Union gone, America were the sole leaders of the world. The assumption was that their model was supreme, and now that China had successfully flirted with capitalism, they would follow America into becoming a full-fledged democracy. China had other ideas. So in the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev began the process of democratization, effectively making the Soviet Union more democratic. As far as Deng Xiaoping was concerned, this was idiotic. Economic reforms had to come first because otherwise your constituents would vote you out for making them poor. And so Deng was clear that democracy would not begin while China remained poor. Remember those issues I raised before? Corruption, high inflation, the hukou underclass? Well, that reached a tipping point by 1989 as crowds of demonstrators occupied Tiananmen Square. As a side note, Tiananmen Square was as much about corruption as it was about democracy, but by the middle of the year, the demonstrators were in the hundreds of thousands. You know the story. The demonstrators appealed for change and Deng sent in the tanks. As another side note, there's actually way more to the story. A handful of PLA soldiers and policemen were brutally killed by some demonstrators before the tanks came in, which resulted in raised tensions, but I'll try and live to get cancelled another day. For me, the really important political legacy of Tiananmen Square is in how it reshaped the Politburo. Remember the big three people? Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang, and of course Deng Xiaoping. Now the whole demonstrations actually began in honour of the death of Hu Yaobang, so they were down to 2. However, Zhao Ziyang completely disagreed with Deng's declaration of martial law, and he offered his resignation from the party. Crucially, Hu and Zhao were the 2 huge advocates for democratizing China, and with both of them now gone, China went into the 1990s with the party having total control over their rapidly growing economy. And for me, it's here where the path to World War III truly began. Not only was the trajectory set for China to gain superpower status, but the end of the 80s saw China locked into a vastly different political system that could give America a future rallying cry to save democracy. But it wasn't just America who would rally against China. Perhaps an even greater critic would go on to be Australia. And within less than a decade, Australia would go from having a Prime Minister speak Mandarin to a Chinese audience, to one of their newspapers saying that Australian lives would be wasted in the South China Sea. To see how all of that unravelled, you've got to click here.